don't go away because you'll want to hear this. I've got Professor Sir John Curtice in studio, in person, for the next 10 minutes or so. He's the polling expert and Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. John, welcome.
Good evening to you,
Thank
Rachel.
you so much for this.
Not at all.
We've got two main topics. I think we're going to start with the Tory leadership because, I mean, all the commentators, I think Emily Maitlis said I almost wet my pants. I mean, did I dream she said that when she heard that James Cleverly had been knocked out? But can you set out what you actually think might have happened?
Well, I can set out what might have happened. I think the honest truth is none of us knows what did happen, and perhaps none of us will ever know what did happen. But anyway, I mean, obviously the starting point is that as of Tuesday at 3:30, James Cleverly was on 39. There are only 120 Tory MPs who were voting because Rishi Sunak was not taking part. So he only needed 2 more votes to get him over the line. And of course, there were 20 votes potentially at stake from Tom Tugendhat. So how do we put this together? Well, one story I've heard, which may or may not be true, is that although Mr Tugendhat and Mr Cleverly are, as it were, both regarded as relatively centrist in this debate, unlike Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch, the relationships between the two gentlemen are not necessarily that good, and therefore perhaps Mr Tugendhat was not necessarily encouraging his erstwhile supporters to back Mr Cleverly. So that might be part of the story, but even so, that wouldn't be sufficient. So then we get into the potential subterfuge. Theory number one, and these are not mutually exclusive. Theory number one is that on Tuesday, some of the people who backed Robert Jenrick backed Mr Cleverly because they wanted to knock Kemi Badenoch off the top perch, and thereby, as it were, to try to create a story that she was losing momentum, and therefore perhaps it would enable Mr Jenrick to get through on Wednesday. That's conspiracy theory number one. But then, of course, these guys or girls, if indeed that's what they did, then went back to Mr Jenrick on Wednesday. Right? That's theory number one. Theory number two is that that Mr Cleverly's camp felt that he would, under some polling evidence to support this, would have a better chance of beating Mr Jenrick in the ballot of the Tory membership than he would Kemi Badenoch, and that therefore perhaps some people who really wanted Mr Cleverly voted for Robert Jenrick in order to try and ensure that he would be past Kemi Badenoch. Well, in the end, it was Miss Badenoch who came first and Mr Cleverly who came last. Now, whether any of this is true, to be honest, we don't know. I mean, certainly nobody has suggested that Mr Cleverly said or did something between 3:30 on Tuesday and the opening of the ballot on Wednesday that would have suddenly put off a significant number of his supporters from being willing to vote for him again.
Two questions, I think, arise from that very clever exposition and very detailed and authoritative as ever, which is one, the stability of the Tory membership. I mean, they Cleverly would maybe lose to Kemi Badenoch last week, but is it as duplicitous or as sophisticated a membership or as labile a grouping as the Tory MPs, or is it more stable?
I think here we get back to how well known are any of these characters. All right. I mean, the truth is we would expect voters to have pretty firm views, including the Tory membership, if these were characters that were widely and well known. And in a sense, the crucial thing we need to know about, all of the people who were involved in this contest is they're not terribly well known. They're not even terribly well known to Tory voters. So again, if you take some of the polling at around the time of the Tory conference, even amongst people who voted Conservative in July, half of them said, I can't tell you what I think about Ms Badenoch and Mr Jenrick. Now, amongst the Tory membership it would be better, but it gives you an indication that perhaps there was still a contest there to won or lost. That said, I mean, even post the conference, Conservative Home, that website, which is often a pretty good indication of where the land lies, and they did go back to the membership after the conference, and they were still finding that Ms Badenoch was the favourite, but still.
Okay, I remember what my other question was, which was in your researches as to what happened. during that vote and around that vote, which saw James cleverly go from being number one to being out.
Yeah.
To what extent are the leadership candidates' campaigns being run and organised? We heard that Grant Shapps had dropped a ball when it came to the Cleverly campaign. Mm-hmm. What were you? I mean, presumably these campaign managers must be doing deals and horse trading with each other.
Well, perhaps. I mean, I think there's a broader point here, and I think it's now something that certainly some Tory MPs are making, is that the potential problem with the way in which the Tories run this process of having successive ballots is that it does set up this possibility that maybe MPs decide to vote strategically, particularly in the last round, in order to try and defeat the person they least want, rather than necessarily voting for the person they most want, right? And that therefore one of the things that's now going around is that perhaps in future, rather than having these exhaustive ballots, they basically should have one ballot in which Tory MPs are invited to put the candidates in order of preference. All of that said, I mean, perhaps in a sense, the big story to take away from what's happened in this leadership contest is that none of the candidates at any point during this contest have succeeded in commanding the support of a majority of Tory MPs. And therefore, to that extent, at least, I mean, A, Tory MPs have not given the membership any clear cue as to whom they might prefer, but B, also, one of the most immediate challenges that whoever wins this contest will have will be to try and simply unite the Tory parliamentary party and to get it behind them. And given that, shall we say, it's pretty clear that the so-called One Nation section of the Conservative Party, the more supposedly centrist section, is refusing to endorse either of the two candidates, that does perhaps give an indication that there at least is going to be a section of Tory MPs that might not be that easy to be won over, and that will certainly be an immediate challenge for the new leader.
And what's your opinion? I think this is a matter of opinion now rather than fact, as to the supposed right-wingedness of the two remaining candidates. Are you getting the sense that they are saying what they think the membership, which is traditionally to the right of the MP body, wants to hear? And do you sense that when in office, when in shadow office anyway, they will pivot back to the centre and the Tory Reform Group is perhaps throwing its toys out of the pram too soon? That
is a $64,000 question. It is an accusation that is, or a suggestion that is sometimes made about Mr Jenrick in particular, simply because Mr Jenrick historically has not been associated with the right wing of the Conservative Party, but it's in the wake of what he says his experience as a Home Office minister that has made him become particularly concerned about that issue. And I think in fairness to him, I mean, there are other aspects in what he's saying, particularly about the health service, which he is saying should be a priority for the Conservative Party, which perhaps is somewhat more centrist in tone. In the case of Kemi Badenoch, I mean, I think many people would say that both her strength and her weakness is that she says what she believes. And to that extent, and that, she is somebody who, for example, does tend to believe in a smaller state, does in particular, is relatively socially conservative, is concerned about woke issues, thinks we are too concerned about equality and diversity issues. She says that. I suspect that's what she believes, and therefore we shouldn't necessarily assume that she, at least, is necessarily going to be inclined to pivot, or at least maybe if she were to become leader, one of those arts of politics for which at the moment she is not entirely renowned for, which is the art of compromise, maybe she will learn it if she does indeed get the post.
Who wrote a book called something? No, it's The Art of the Deal. That was Donald Trump. Nobody's written a book called The Art of the Compromise yet, have they?
No, but it is a crucial art of politics if you're going to bring a large number of people together. Okay,
you're not a betting man. You're a pollster and a political expert. Do you think it's going to be Kemi?
Yes, I think, the honest truth is that from the beginning of this leadership contest, given what we know about the attitudes and preferences of the membership, it looked like a contest for Ms Badenoch to lose. She had some missteps during the Tory conference, but I think, it's Mr Jenrick who will have the work to do in order to try to persuade the voters that he's got a better task. And clearly his strategy is essentially to say, look, I'm offering you some detailed proposals. In particular, the fact that he's saying we should definitely get out of the European Convention on Human Rights, whereas even Ms Badenoch, despite the conservatism I talked about earlier, is saying, well, not necessarily. and is wanting to talk more broadly about values. I mean, I think it will be interesting. Their tactics are clearly different. One might feel that in the end their message is similar, but the way in which they're selling it is different. And, maybe Mr Jenrick will be able, through his approach of being perhaps slightly more specific, maybe he'll be able to win over some of those people that Ms Badenoch might otherwise win. But I think the truth is she certainly starts off as the favourite.
So were you must have been then unsurprised when James Cleverly spun out of the contest and leaving Kemi Badenoch? Were you as surprised as everyone else?
I was genuinely surprised because my view had long been that of these various characters, as I said, none of them terribly well known, but the one who had at least a degree of public reputation was Mr Cleverly, and the one who, in terms of past performance, we knew probably could give a good speech. We also know that occasionally he perhaps could say things, at least in private, that he regretted saying. But he was, to that extent, at least regarded as sure-footed category. Whereas I think the honest truth is that neither Kemi Badenoch nor Robert Jenrick have so far at least been somebody who has suggested that they can command a large stage. And to that extent, therefore, and this is a crucial attribute, can they necessarily command the attention of the wider public? And to that extent, at least, they are both of them, as it were, leaders, if they are going to become leaders still to be made, rather than necessarily the finished product.
Okay. Which brings us neatly, I would say, to another new leader. I mean, he led the Labour Party for several years, but he's now leading the country, Keir Starmer.
Yep.
His popularity levels are not great.
No, but they never have been.
After 100 days in office. And one of my erudite callers pointed out one of the reasons for this is very few people actually voted for Labour or Keir Starmer.
Sure. I mean, the first thing we have to remember, despite that enormous majority, Labour only got 35% of the vote. No previous government has got any kind of overall majority with so low a share of vote in the past. And it's very, very clear that the principal motivation of probably most voters in the election was, we want to get rid of the Conservatives. For some people who still believe in the Brexit project and are concerned about immigration, they were happy to vote for reform and they weren't concerned about the consequences. For other voters, they voted for either Labour or the Liberal Democrats, depending on the situation in their constituency. If it was Liberal Democrats who looked as though they could beat the Tories locally, they voted for them. If it looks as though it was Labour, they voted for them. And to that extent, at least, it's a very, very thin electoral base. But the thing in particular to understand about Sir Keir Starmer is he's never been popular. Indeed, certainly since 1979, when Mrs Thatcher became Prime Minister, certainly since then, no previous person who has kind of become Prime Minister on the back of an election has been as unpopular as Sir Keir Starmer was at that point in time. Now, it was true that once he won, for a brief spell, of course, people said, oh, maybe he's not so bad after all. But, it very rapidly has gone down. Indeed, his numbers are now worse than they were. But, he's never managed to win himself to the hearts of the public.
Does popularity matter, though? I mean, he's got a majority. He's in office, I would imagine, for the duration, for a full term. He's got time on his side. He's got a majority on his side.
Yes.
What he doesn't seem to have is a project.
Exactly.
Is a mission.
Exactly. And I think this is the point, is that, does he have to worry too much about the short-term politics? No. But I think one way to think about what's happened is that what we've seen under the pressure of government is an exposure of at least 2, perhaps 3 strategic weaknesses in what Labour were offering the country at the beginning of July. Number one is there was no narrative. So the campaign slogan was change, but change to what? I mean, they were riding the tide of the Conservatives on popularity.
That was their raison d'etre, was it was going to be a change of government. Now that's happened.
Sure.
Now what?
And of course, one of the things one has to realise, Sir Keir Starmer is a brilliant lawyer. You don't want to be on the other side of an argument with him if he's acting as prosecuting counsel. But of course, one of the things about lawyers is that they prosecute a brief that somebody else has written. Politicians have to write their own brief. Sir Keir Starmer is not unique in that respect in not being able to write a narrative. I don't think Rishi Sunak had a narrative in the election. I don't think Sir Ed Davey did. The one person who did, of course, was Nigel Farage. But the point is, therefore, that once they've gone into government, and particularly because of the fact that they came into office in the summer. There wasn't much news. They weren't able to.
Well, there were the riots.
There was, but beyond that, as it were, there's very little in the way of government initiative, and there won't be until this month. Is that as a result, then people have picked apart what they've got and created their own narrative. And the second weakness is, and it's all part of the Sue Gray story, is that Sir Keir Starmer's political antennae are not very strong. He's not very good at spotting the political problems that are going to come down the track. It was illustrated well before he became Prime Minister, when you will remember he admitted Natalie Elphicke, fairly right-wing, Conservative MP for Dover, who had hitherto been rather critical of the Conservative Party, at a time when the suspension of Diane Abbott had not been resolved. And immediately we all went...
Tone deaf.
It's going to be the next story.
John, you're wonderful. As ever, you're so right. You pointed out, essentially, he hasn't written his own narrative. Therefore, the media and the public are writing it for him, and they're not giving him a very good report card so far.
Indeed.
Sir John Curtice, thank you as ever for all your insights this evening.